My name is Gianna Harper. I'm 35 years old. I stood in the principal's office, my hands trembling as two wealthy parents stared me down like I was dirt beneath their designer heels. Their daughter was a few rooms away, being dramatic over a scraped arm. My daughter, Ella, was sitting on a hard chair just outside the door, terrified and alone. The mother's words cut like glass. "You should apologize for raising such a violent child. Maybe if she had a father, she'd have better manners." Her husband added a smug smirk. "We're recommending suspension. Frankly, some people just shouldn't be parents." The principal wouldn't meet my eyes. He just slid a document across his desk, a pre-written lie, an admission that my daughter was solely at fault, with a blank line waiting for my signature. They saw a poor, single mother they could easily crush, a woman with no power and no voice, but they didn't know that with a single phone call, I could shatter their entire illusion of superiority. Because the man they assumed didn't exist, the man who raised me as his own, was one of the most powerful billionaires in the state, and he was about to find out what they did to his granddaughter. But before I tell you how everything flipped, like, subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. For my entire life, I've felt like I was standing with one foot in two completely different worlds. One was a world of unimaginable luxury, of glass towers and silent chauffeured cars. The other was a world of survival, of ramen noodles and secondhand clothes, of a fierce, desperate need to prove I belonged to myself and no one else. The contradiction has defined me, and to understand why I made the call I did, you have to understand the girl who was raised in both worlds, but felt she belonged in neither. It started in a world that was small, but entirely ours. My biological father was a ghost, a faded photograph in an album, a man who walked out of our tiny New York apartment before my 5th birthday. He was a literature student who loved the idea of a family more than the reality of one. He left my mother with a box of old paperbacks, a pile of unpaid bills, and me. My mother, Evelyn, was the opposite of a ghost. She was the most solid person I've ever known, a woman made of pure, unbending resilience. She worked as a hotel receptionist, standing for 10 hours a day in uncomfortable shoes. Yet she always came home with a smile for me. I remember the scent of her cheap hairspray and the weary look in her eyes as she'd sit at our small kitchen table, counting her tips, separating the bills into little piles for rent, for groceries, for the electric company. Some nights there wasn't much left over, but she never let me see her fear. Instead, she'd pull me onto her lap and read to me from one of the books my father had left behind, her voice soft and steady, creating worlds for us to escape into. We were a team, a fortress of two against a city that didn't care if we survived. She taught me, without ever saying the words, that a woman's strength was her ability to stand on her own, again and again, no matter how many times life tried to knock her down. When I was 12, the walls of our fortress were breached. My mother remarried. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was a slow, cautious courtship that I watched with deep suspicion. Her new husband, Richard Montgomery, was a guest at the hotel where she worked. He wasn't flashy or loud. He was a quiet, powerful man who moved through the world as if it were his own private boardroom. And in many ways he was a titan of industry, a visionary who didn't just own buildings but reshaped the very skyline of the city. His name was a quiet currency of power, whispered in circles I couldn't even imagine. The first time he came to our apartment for dinner, it felt like a king visiting a peasant's hut. His expensive leather shoes looked comically out of place on our worn linoleum floor. He brought a bottle of wine that probably cost more than our weekly grocery budget, and a ridiculously oversized bouquet of flowers that barely fit in our biggest vase. He spoke to me gently, asking about school, about my favorite books. I answered in monosyllables, watching him with the wary eyes of a cornered animal. I couldn't understand what my vibrant, independent mother saw in this quiet, calculating man. One night I asked her, "He's just so different," I'd said, unable to articulate my distrust. She'd smoothed my hair back and said, "He's the kindest man I've ever met, Gianna. He's steady. He makes me feel safe." But I didn't want to be safe. I wanted our fortress of two back. Soon, we moved out of our cozy, cramped apartment and into his world. His home was a penthouse, a sterile glass box in the sky that felt more like a museum than a home. The silence was the first thing I noticed. In our old building, you could hear neighbors arguing, babies crying, the constant hum of life. Here, there was only a hushed stillness, broken by the distant sound of city traffic far below. Richard tried his best. He had a room decorated for me in my favorite colors, shelves filled with books by my favorite authors. He had a heart big enough to not just love my mother, but to try and love the angry, wounded girl who came with her. He legally adopted me, giving me his name, a name that felt like a heavy, ill-fitting coat. He saw the wall I had built around myself and decided, with endless patience, to simply wait for me to come out. But I never did. I interpreted his kindness as a strategy, his patience as a tactic. I was a traumatized kid, convinced that every man eventually leaves, and the nicer Richard was, the more devastating the inevitable goodbye would be. I couldn't bear to be abandoned twice, so I pushed him away with the relentless dedication only a teenager can muster. For my 16th birthday, he offered me a brand new car. I told him I preferred taking the subway. He hired the best tutors when I struggled with math. I told them I didn't need their help and deliberately let my grades slip before pulling them back up on my own. I got a part-time job at a local diner, scrubbing floors and bussing tables, just to have money that wasn't his, a small piece of my life that he couldn't touch. Every act of rebellion was a declaration of independence, a desperate scream into the silent luxury of that penthouse. I am not one of you. You cannot own me. The day I turned 18 was the day I escaped. I had been accepted to a state college a few hours away. Richard and my mother sat me down in the vast living room, the skyline glittering behind them. "Gianna, please," my mother had pleaded, her eyes filled with the pain I was causing. "Let us pay your tuition. Let us get you an apartment, a car. You don't have to struggle." Richard's voice was calm, reasonable. "This isn't about control, Gianna. It's about giving you the best possible start. You've earned it." I stood up, my backpack filled with the few things I considered my own. I looked at my mother, the woman who had taught me everything about strength. "I have to do this myself," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "I have to know that I can. Like you did, Mom. I have to build my own life." I walked out of that penthouse, out of the world of Richard Montgomery, and into a life I was determined to create from scratch. I didn't look back. For the next 15 years, I kept my promise to myself. I built a life, brick by painful, prideful brick. It wasn't the life of glamour and ease I had run from, but it was mine, and that made it more valuable than all the money in the world. College was a brutal lesson in self-reliance. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. I was a waitress by night, slinging greasy plates in a 24-hour diner, my feet aching and my hair smelling of fried onions. By day, between classes, I worked in the university library, the quiet and the smell of old paper a welcome sanctuary. I lived on instant noodles and cheap coffee, my budget calculated down to the last penny. There were nights I was so exhausted I'd fall asleep on my textbooks, my alarm blaring at 5 a.m. for an early shift before my first lecture. I remember one specific moment during my sophomore year finals week. My old secondhand laptop, my absolute lifeline, died. A blue screen of death, final and absolute. I sat on my dorm room floor, tears of pure, helpless frustration streaming down my face. All my notes, my final papers, everything was gone. The urge to call Richard was a physical ache in my chest. One call, that's all it would take. A new laptop would probably be delivered to my door within the hour. I could hear his calm voice. "Just tell me what you need, Gianna." I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over his name in my contacts. But I couldn't do it. It felt like surrender. It felt like admitting that my mother and I hadn't been enough, that I wasn't enough. I put the phone down, took a deep breath, and spent the next 72 hours rewriting my papers from memory in the 24-hour computer lab, fueled by vending machine coffee and sheer unadulterated stubbornness. I passed all my finals. That small, painful victory meant more to me than the diploma itself. When I graduated, my mother was in the audience, her eyes shining with tears. Richard had offered to fly in for the ceremony, but I had politely told him not to. I needed that day to be mine. After college, I poured my energy into a career that was the antithesis of Richard's world. I became a community educator, working for a small nonprofit that helped adults who had dropped out of high school get their diplomas. My work was in underfunded community centers, in rooms with peeling paint and donated computers. It wasn't about profit margins or hostile takeovers. It was about second chances. It was about empowering people who, like me, felt like the world had been designed for someone else. It was during this time that I met Derek. He was a history teacher, passionate and idealistic, with a quick smile and eyes that seemed to see the real me, not the ghost of a billionaire's name. He loved that I was independent. He admired my work ethic. For the first time, I let my guard down. I thought maybe this is what it feels like. A partnership. A fortress built for two, but this time by choice. We fell in love, and for a couple of years it was easy. We built a life in a small rental apartment, full of mismatched furniture and big dreams. Then, history, that cruel and repetitive teacher, gave me another lesson. I got pregnant. I remember the moment I told him. We were in our small kitchen, the scent of garlic and pasta in the air. I held up the positive pregnancy test, my heart a frantic mix of terror and exhilarating joy. At first, he was happy, or he pretended to be. But soon, the charming, idealistic man I loved began to fade. The promises of a future together were replaced by nervous excuses. He started working late. He became distant, cold. The man who had admired my independence now used it as a weapon. "You're so strong, Gianna," he'd say. "You don't really need me." It was his escape clause. He walked out before Ella was born, leaving a note on the kitchen counter that said simply, "I'm sorry, I can't do this." The pain was breathtakingly familiar, a ghost from my own childhood, now revisited upon my unborn daughter. But out of that wreckage, I found a new kind of strength. The moment I held Ella in my arms, everything clicked into place. She was perfect. She was mine, and I would never, ever let her feel the sting of abandonment that I had. She became my entire world. The heartbreak from Derek faded into the background, replaced by the all-consuming fierce love for my child. With a new resolve, I saved every penny I could. It took me years, but I finally bought a small 2-bedroom house in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood. It was nothing fancy. It had a leaky faucet and a yard that was mostly weeds, but it was ours. We painted the walls ourselves, Ella leaving small, multicolored handprints on the baseboards. We planted a small garden in the backyard. Her drawings, vibrant and full of life, were taped to every surface of the refrigerator. Our nights were filled with bedtime stories, and our weekends with building elaborate blanket forts in the living room. It wasn't a penthouse in the sky, but it was a home, a kingdom of our own making. We were a fortress of two, and this time I was sure the walls were strong enough to protect us from anything. I had built a life where we were safe, where we were enough. I thought that was all that mattered. The bullying started the way a slow leak starts, a single drop at a time until you're suddenly standing in a flood. Ella's elementary school was one of the best in our district. I'd researched it for months, chosen our small house specifically so we'd be in the right zone. For the first 2 years, it was wonderful. She loved her teachers, she made friends, and she came home every day buzzing with stories about what she'd learned. The crack in her perfect world appeared in the 3rd grade, and its name was Sophie Langford. Sophie was the kind of child who had been taught from birth that the world was her personal stage. She wore designer clothes that were worth more than my monthly grocery bill, and spoke with a casual authority that intimidated other children and even some of the teachers. Her parents, David and Amelia Langford, were pillars of the community, which meant they owned everything and presided over the PTA with an iron fist. Their power was a constant, unspoken presence in the school's hallways. The first drop of poison came home with Ella one afternoon. I was making dinner when she walked into the kitchen, her usual sunny energy gone. She sat at the table and stared at her hands. "Mom," she whispered, her voice so small I had to lean in to hear her. "Sophie told everyone at lunch that we're poor because you have an old car." I felt a flash of hot anger, but I pushed it down, forcing a gentle laugh. "Oh, honey, we're not poor," I said, pulling her into a hug. "We have everything we need, and our car works just fine, doesn't it? It gets us where we need to go. Some people just think new things are the most important thing. We know better." I thought a simple, loving explanation would be enough. I was wrong. It was just the beginning. Sophie, emboldened by the lack of consequences, escalated her campaign. A few weeks later, Ella came home in tears, clutching a ripped piece of paper. It was her art project, a beautiful watercolor of a starry night that her teacher had praised and hung on the classroom wall. Ella had been so proud. Now it was in 2 pieces. "Sophie said it was ugly and she ripped it down," Ella sobbed. And when I told the teacher, she just said Sophie probably did it by accident. I immediately emailed the teacher, Mrs. Gable. Her reply was polite but dismissive. "Hi, Gianna, I spoke with Sophie. She said it was an accident, that she tripped near the wall. These things happen. I've told the girls to be more careful. It was a lie and we all knew it. But Mrs. Gable didn't want a problem with the Langfords. It was easier to pretend. The bullying became more insidious. It turned social. Sophie would host exclusive weekend parties and make sure every girl in their circle was invited except Ella. She would organize games on the playground and declare that Ella wasn't allowed to play. My daughter, who had always been so bright and social, began to eat her lunch alone. She would come home and go straight to her room, the silence from behind her door a constant, painful weight in our small house. I saw her light, the most precious thing in the world to me, dimming day by day. I tried to fight it through the proper channels. I scheduled a meeting with the school counselor. She was a kind but ineffective woman who spoke in therapeutic platitudes. Children can be cruel. she said, handing me a pamphlet on building resilience. Perhaps Ella is misinterpreting Sophie's behavior. Maybe she could try to be friendlier to Sophie? The suggestion that my daughter, the victim, was responsible for fixing the problem made my blood boil. They were asking her to befriend her tormentor. The final straw came on a Tuesday during recess. The story came to me later in pieces, from a friend of Ella's who had seen the whole thing. Sophie and her two main followers had cornered Ella near the lockers. The verbal taunts were crueler than usual. "My mom says your mom's single because nobody wants her," Sophie had sneered. "You don't even have a dad. You're basically an orphan." That was the line that broke my daughter's weeks of pained silence. Ella's voice, small but firm, cut through their laughter. "Stop it," she said. "You're lying. Leave me alone." Sophie, furious at being challenged in front of her friends, shoved Ella hard. My daughter stumbled back, hitting the lockers with a clang. And in that moment, after weeks of being chipped away, of being made to feel small and worthless, my gentle, kind-hearted daughter reacted. It wasn't a calculated punch or a malicious attack. It was a desperate, instinctual push, an 8-year-old's raw cry of enough. Sophie, a born performer, seized the opportunity. She stumbled dramatically, fell to the ground and began to wail, clutching her arm as if it had been broken, though it was only scraped. Teachers came running. They saw the powerful girl on the ground crying, and my daughter standing over her, silent and shaking. They made an instant judgment. The bully became the victim became the aggressor, and my daughter, my sweet Ella, became the violent one. The phone call came at 2:15 p.m., ripping through the quiet of my office. Northwood Elementary flashed on the screen, and a cold metallic dread washed over me. I stepped into the hallway, my hand shaking as I answered. "This is Gianna Harper. Ms. Harper, this is Principal Douglas. There's been a very serious incident involving Ella. You need to come to the school immediately." His voice was flat, bureaucratic, and devoid of any warmth. It was the voice of a man delivering bad news he didn't want to be bothered by. "A serious incident? Is she okay? What happened?" I asked, my own voice rising in panic. "We can discuss it when you get here. Ms. Harper, please come to the main office," he said, and then the line went dead. The 10-minute drive to the school felt like an eternity. My mind raced, replaying every possible scenario. Was she hurt? Did she fall? With every red light, my anxiety grew. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, a primal fear mixing with a rising tide of protective anger. I thought of my own childhood, of all the times I had felt small and powerless. I had sworn I would never let my daughter feel that way. When I walked into the principal's office, the scene was already set. It felt less like a meeting and more like an ambush. David and Amelia Langford were seated in the 2 chairs in front of the desk, a united, formidable front. They looked up at me as I entered, their faces masks of cold, righteous indignation. Principal Douglas was behind his desk, shuffling papers, a man who clearly wished he could become invisible. Ella was not in the room. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Harper," Mr. Douglas began, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall just over my shoulder. "As I said on the phone, there has been a serious physical altercation. Sophie Langford has been assaulted by your daughter. Assaulted." The word hung in the air, ugly and wrong. Before I could even speak, Amelia Langford cut in, her voice dripping with venom. "Assaulted is the correct word. Your daughter, unprovoked, pushed my Sophie to the ground. We send our daughter to a public school to learn humility, but there are limits. This kind of violent behavior is unacceptable. My daughter has been bullied by yours for months," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I have emails. I've spoken to the counselor." "This wasn't unprovoked," David Langford scoffed, a deep, arrogant sound. "Oh, the bullying excuse. How predictable. Our Sophie is a sweet, popular girl. She doesn't have a history of this. Your daughter, on the other hand, I've spoken to my friend on the school board. He agrees that a zero-tolerance policy for violence is essential to maintain the school's reputation." It was a threat, plain and simple. He was reminding us all who was really in charge. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. Every instinct screamed at me to fight back, to yell, but I knew it would only make me look like the unstable, emotional single mother they already believed me to be. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm for Ella's sake. "Where is my daughter?" I asked, my voice tight. "Have you even spoken to her? Have you asked for her side of the story?" Mr. Douglas finally looked at me, his expression pained, weak. "Ella is in the counselor's office. Given the circumstances and the clarity of the situation, I felt it was best to speak with the parents first." "Gianna," he said, switching to my first name in a pathetic attempt at connection. "This is the quickest way to move past this for everyone." He pushed a single sheet of paper across the desk, the pre-written apology. Amelia Langford leaned forward again, her eyes glinting. Perhaps if you spent less time at that little charity job of yours and more time actually parenting, this wouldn't have happened. Children need supervision. They need structure. Frankly, you should be apologizing to us. That was it. The final condescending straw. The insult wasn't just about me. It was an attack on my entire life. On my mother's life. On every single mother who works her fingers to the bone to provide for her children. It triggered a memory of my own mother, standing tall and proud in the face of judgment. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. The years of quiet accommodation, of trying not to make waves, of proving I could do it all alone, it all fell away. I realized that being quiet was the same as admitting they were right. I pushed my chair back and stood up slowly. The shift in my posture, the sudden stillness, made all three of them look at me. The room went silent. My voice, when I spoke, was calm, steady, and colder than any of them expected. I will not be signing this lie, I said, looking directly into Mr. Douglas's wavering eyes. And I will not allow you, I turned my gaze to the Langfords, to bully my child and then punish her for it when she finally stands up for herself. I picked up my purse from the floor. This meeting is over. You have made a very, very serious mistake today. I walked to the door, my hand on the knob. You will be hearing from my family's legal representative. I walked out of that office, leaving a stunned silence in my wake. I saw Ella on the chair outside, her small face pale, her eyes wide with fear. I knelt down in front of her, took her small, cold hands in mine, and gave her a smile I didn't feel. Come on, sweetie, I whispered, my voice thick with a promise. We're going home. I'm going to fix this. And as we walked hand in hand out of that school, I knew exactly who I had to call. My fortress of two was no longer enough. It was time to call in an army. The drive home from the school was a bubble of tense silence. I held the steering wheel with a grip so tight my knuckles were white, my eyes focused on the road, but my mind was replaying the scene in the principal's office on a torturous loop. Each sneer from Amelia Langford, each condescending word from her husband, each moment of cowardly silence from Principal Douglas was a fresh cut. Beside me, Ella was unnaturally still, her small hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the window. She was trying to be brave for me, and that fact broke my heart more than anything else. Are they going to kick me out of school, Mommy? She finally whispered, her voice so fragile it was barely audible over the hum of the engine. I reached over and squeezed her hand, forcing a confident smile onto my face that felt like a brittle mask. No, sweetie. Absolutely not. You did nothing wrong. Mommy is going to fix this. I promise. The words felt hollow in my own ears. I had no plan, no power, no idea how I was going to keep that promise. I felt like a complete failure. I had built this entire life, this fortress of two, with the singular goal of protecting her, and on the first real test, the walls had crumbled. I had failed to keep her safe. That evening, I went through the motions of our nightly routine. I made her favorite dinner, macaroni and cheese from a box, but neither of us had much of an appetite. We read a chapter from her favorite book, but my voice was flat and her eyes were distant. When I tucked her into bed, she clung to me, her small body trembling slightly. Sophie lied, she whispered into my shoulder. I didn't attack her. She pushed me first. I know, baby, I whispered back, my throat tight with unshed tears. I know you didn't, and I am so proud of you for telling her to stop. I held her until her breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. Then I quietly closed her bedroom door and walked into the deafening silence of my house. I stood in my kitchen, the heart of our home, but it offered no comfort tonight. The colorful drawings on the refrigerator seemed to mock me with their innocence. A stack of bills on the counter was a stark reminder of my precarious financial reality. I leaned against the counter, the cold laminate seeping through my sweater, and finally let the facade crack. The humiliation washed over me in a sickening wave. You single mothers always make excuses. Maybe if she had a father. Some people just shouldn't be parents. They hadn't just attacked my daughter. They had attacked the very core of my identity, my life's work, my worth as a mother. I had spent 15 years proving I didn't need anyone, and they had shown me in 15 minutes just how alone I truly was. Defeated, I sank into a chair at the kitchen table. For the first time, I admitted to myself that my pride was not enough. My independence could not protect my child from the cruelty of people who wielded money and influence like weapons. My fierce love on its own was not a match for their power. I couldn't fix this. Not alone. My phone was on the table, a dark, silent rectangle. I picked it up, my fingers scrolling through my contacts on autopilot. And then I saw it. The name I hadn't dialed in nearly 6 years. Richard Montgomery. A flood of conflicting emotions washed over me. Shame, resentment, guilt, and a tiny, flickering spark of something I hadn't felt all day, hope. I thought of all the times he had tried to help, the doors he had tried to open, and all the times I had stubbornly, proudly slammed them shut in his face. What right did I have to call him now? I was the one who had walked away. I was the one who had insisted on this struggle. Calling him now felt like the ultimate surrender, an admission that my entire life's philosophy had been a mistake. But then, the image of Ella's face, pale and terrified in the hallway of her school, flashed in my mind. The memory of her small voice asking if she was going to be kicked out. And in that instant, my pride simply evaporated. It was a luxury I could no longer afford. My love for my daughter was infinitely stronger than my pride. My hands were shaking as I pressed the call button. It rang once, twice. I almost hung up, my courage failing. Then he answered, "Gianna?" His voice. It was exactly the same. Calm, familiar, warm. There was no surprise, no accusation, just my name, spoken as if we had talked yesterday. Tears I hadn't even realized I was holding back began to stream down my face. "Hi, Richard," I said, my voice choked and broken. I need help, but not for me. It's for Ella." There was a slight pause. "Tell me everything," he said, his tone gentle but firm, and so I did. The words poured out of me in a torrent of pain and anger. I told him about the months of relentless bullying, the ripped artwork, the social isolation. I told him about my useless meetings with the teacher and the counselor, how the school had ignored my pleas. I told him about the confrontation by the lockers, about Sophie's lies. I described the meeting in the principal's office, the condescending sneers of the Langfords, the pre-written confession they had tried to force me to sign. I told him every humiliating, insulting word they had said about me being a single mother. I left nothing out. I just talked until I was empty, my story ending in a ragged sob. He was silent on the other end of the line, and for a terrifying second, I thought I had made a mistake, that he was judging me. But his silence wasn't judgment. It was the quiet of a powerful mind processing information, formulating a strategy. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. The warmth was still there, but it was now wrapped around a core of soft, unbending steel. "What is the principal's full name, Gianna?" "Robert Douglas," I sniffled. "And the other family?" "Langford. David and Amelia Langford." "I see," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the hair on my arm stand up. "Gianna, you listen to me. You did the right thing by standing up to them, and you did the right thing by calling me. I need you to stop worrying now. I want you to go to bed and get some sleep. You've been strong for long enough. Let me handle this." "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Tomorrow morning," he said, his voice a calm promise of retribution. "You and I are going to that school, and we are going to handle this. You are not alone anymore." When I hung up the phone, the crushing weight on my chest had lifted. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't just Gianna Harper, a fortress of one. I had called for backup, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that the army was on its way. I slept fitfully, my dreams a chaotic replay of the day's events. But when I woke, the morning light filtering through my window felt different. The familiar dread that had been my companion for weeks was still there, a low hum in the background, but it was overshadowed by a strange, unfamiliar feeling, a fragile, tentative hope. My promise to Ella no longer felt like an impossible burden. It felt like a plan waiting to be executed. At 7 a.m., my phone rang. It was Richard. "Good morning, Gianna. I hope you slept. A car will be at your house at 8:30 to bring you to the school. We'll meet there. Just focus on getting Ella ready." His voice was calm, efficient, the voice of a man already in motion, a man shifting pieces on a chessboard I couldn't see. There was no more discussion, no more questions. The matter was in his hands. I made Ella breakfast, my movements lighter than they had been in months. I told her we were going back to the school to talk to the principal again, and this time, Grandpa Richard was going to come with us. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of childish awe. She knew Richard as the kind, quiet man who sent her lavish birthday presents, not as a titan of industry. To her, he was just Grandpa, but even she seemed to understand that his presence changed the equation. At exactly 8:30, a car pulled up to our curb. It wasn't a flashy limousine or a gaudy sports car. It was a sleek, black German sedan, the kind of car that doesn't need to announce its owner's wealth. It was so understated that it screamed power. A man in a simple dark suit got out, opened the back door for me, and nodded respectfully. "Ms. Harper." The ride was silent and smooth. I watched my small, humble neighborhood roll by, feeling like I was being transported to another dimension, a world where problems were not struggled with, but simply handled. We didn't go straight to the school. The driver pulled into the parking lot of a small upscale cafe a few blocks away. Richard was already there, sitting at a quiet corner table, not alone. He stood up as I approached, kissing my cheek. "Gianna, you look tired." He gestured to the two people sitting with him. "This is my legal counsel, Ms. Davies, and my communications advisor, Mr. Chen." Ms. Davies was a sharp, impeccably dressed woman in her 50s with eyes that missed nothing. She gave me a firm handshake and a small, reassuring smile. Mr. Chen was younger, calm and observant, and he simply nodded, his fingers tapping away at a tablet. This wasn't just a grandfather coming to defend his family. This was a corporate C-suite preparing for a hostile takeover. Richard had brought his entire professional arsenal to an elementary school meeting. He motioned for me to sit. "Walk us through it one more time," he said. And so I did, my voice steadier this time, laying out the facts while Ms. Davies took notes, and Mr. Chen's fingers flew across his screen, pulling up information on the Langfords, on Principal Douglas, on the school district's board members. "Langford Development," Mr. Chen said quietly, without looking up. "Significant regional player. Over-leveraged on their new waterfront project. They've been trying to get a meeting with you for 6 months, Richard." Richard's face remained impassive, but a flicker of understanding crossed his eyes. The picture was becoming clearer. When I was finished, Richard looked at his watch. "It's time." We drove the final few blocks to the school. Our single car was now joined by 2 others, forming a small, intimidating convoy. We pulled into the visitor parking lot at the peak of morning drop-off. The lot, a sea of minivans and SUVs, suddenly had a trio of identical black sedans parked in its center. The effect was immediate and profound. Parents hustling their kids toward the entrance stopped mid-stride. They stared, their curiosity piqued. Teachers, monitoring the crosswalk, paused to whisper to one another. Richard stepped out of his car, flanked by his team. He walked over to my car and opened the door for me. A simple, chivalrous gesture that, in this context, was a powerful statement of allegiance. As we walked toward the school's main entrance, the normal morning chatter seemed to die down around us. We were a silent, purposeful procession, and we were drawing every eye. The school's front office was a place of controlled chaos, but as we entered, a hush fell. The secretary, a formidable woman named Mrs. Gable, who usually ran her domain with an iron fist, looked up from her computer. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight of 3 people in expensive suits standing behind me. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her usual brusque tone softened with uncertainty. Richard stepped forward. "Richard Montgomery," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "We have a meeting with Principal Douglas regarding my granddaughter, Ella Harper." Mrs. Gable's face went pale. She knew the name. Everyone in this state knew the name. She fumbled with her phone, her fingers suddenly clumsy. "Yes, of course, Mr. Montgomery, right away. Please have a seat." We didn't sit. We waited, a silent, imposing presence. A moment later, the door to the principal's office flew open. Mr. Douglas stood there, a forced, nervous smile plastered on his face. Then his eyes fell on Richard, and the smile froze, then completely collapsed. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. Mr. Montgomery," he stammered, his hand flying up to straighten a tie that was already perfectly straight. I had no idea. This is an incredible honor." "I assure you, Principal, it's not," Richard said, his voice flat and cold. He gestured for me to enter the office, following close behind. We were settling into the chairs when the Langfords arrived, 5 minutes late, radiating arrogance. They pushed open the door without knocking. "Sorry we're late," David Langford announced, a smug grin on his face. "Had to take a call with the mayor." Amelia's eyes landed on me and she smirked. "Well, look who's back for another round. Didn't you learn your lesson yesterday?" Then their gaze shifted. They saw the 2 imposing figures standing behind my chair. They saw the man sitting next to me. The man whose tailored gray suit was a quiet statement of power they could only dream of. I watched the slow-motion wave of recognition, then dawning horror, wash over their faces. The smirk on David's face didn't just fade. It looked as if it had been chiseled off, leaving behind a slack-jawed mask of disbelief. Amelia's face, which had been a mask of condescending pity, drained of all color. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to the pearls at her throat. They knew who he was. David Langford, the big-shot developer, had just swaggered into a room with the man who owned the sky under which he operated. The power in the room hadn't just shifted. It had been completely and utterly annihilated and then remade, with us at its center. The hunt was over, and the predators had just realized they were the prey. The air in the small office crackled with a new, suffocating tension. Principal Douglas, who had been sputtering attempts at welcoming Richard, now seemed to shrink behind his desk, a man witnessing his own execution. The Langfords stood frozen just inside the doorway, their arrogance from moments before replaced by a raw, naked panic. Richard didn't even look at them. He gestured for me to take the chair directly opposite the principal's desk. Then he sat beside me, a calm, solid presence. Ms. Davies and Mr. Chen remained standing behind us, a silent, formidable wall of competence. Richard folded his hands on his knee and began, his voice disarmingly calm, the tone a CEO might use to review quarterly earnings. Principal Douglas, let's begin with a clear and factual timeline of events, shall we? So there are no further misunderstandings. He didn't wait for a response. On or around September 12th of this year, my granddaughter, Ella Harper, first reported being verbally harassed by another student, Sophie Langford. No action was taken. Over the subsequent 4 weeks, the harassment escalated to include destruction of property and social ostracization. My daughter, Gianna Harper, contacted Ella's teacher, Mrs. Gable, via email on 3 separate occasions, and spoke with the school counselor once by phone. These attempts to resolve the situation were met with inaction and dismissal. As he spoke, he laid out the facts with the cold, irrefutable precision of a surgeon. He had absorbed every detail of my pained, rambling story from the night before and was now presenting it as a coherent, damning case. The Langfords finally seemed to recover enough to move, shuffling awkwardly into the 2 remaining chairs, as far from Richard as possible. Richard then turned his attention to the principal. Yesterday, a physical altercation occurred. You were presented with 2 conflicting stories, one from the known aggressor and one from the victim of long-term bullying. You chose, without any investigation, to accept the word of the aggressor. You then attempted to coerce my daughter into signing a document containing false statements, using the suspension of her child as leverage. He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle in the silent room. At this point, I'll turn it over to my legal counsel. Ms. Davies stepped forward, holding a tablet. Her voice was sharp and clear, with no room for ambiguity. Principal Douglas, as of this morning, you are in direct violation of this district's official anti-bullying and harassment policy, specifically Sections 4A, which mandates a formal investigation following any parental complaint, and 5C, which requires documentation of all reported incidents. Your failure to act on Ms. Harper's repeated complaints constitutes gross negligence. She swiped a finger on the screen. Furthermore, your actions yesterday, in attempting to compel a parent to sign a false statement under duress, not only violates the parent's Bill of Rights, but also opens you, this school, and this entire district to significant legal and financial liability. We have already documented Ms. Harper's testimony. Douglas looked like he was going to be physically ill. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. Now, Richard turned his calm, assessing gaze to the Langfords. It was as if he was just noticing them for the first time. Mr. and Mrs. Langford, yesterday you sat in this office and you made a series of cruel and unfounded statements about my daughter's character and her fitness as a parent, based on the fact that she is a single mother. His voice dropped, losing its boardroom quality and taking on a deeply personal, chilling edge. Let me be perfectly clear. My daughter is one of the strongest, most capable people I have ever known. She chose to build a life on her own terms, a life of integrity and hard work, and she has raised a brilliant, kind-hearted child. You mistook her lack of pretense for a lack of resources. You mistook her independence for weakness. You saw a woman you thought you could crush, and in your arrogance, you made a grave and irreversible miscalculation. David Langford, a man clearly used to being the most powerful person in any room, finally found his voice. It was a weak, blustering attempt to regain control. Now hold on a minute, he started, raising a hand. We were just acting as concerned parents. No, Richard cut him off, his voice sharp as broken glass. The single word silenced Langford more effectively than a shout ever could. You hold on. Langford Development, you have a zoning petition for that new waterfront project, don't you? The one that requires 3 environmental exemptions from the state board? Richard let the question hang in the air, a blatant, undisguised threat. He didn't have to say that he had more influence with the state board than any developer in the region. David Langford's face went ashen. He understood. Richard then turned his full attention back to the principal, who looked as though he was praying for the floor to swallow him whole. And you, Principal Douglas, this school is an excellent institution. I know, because it is built on land that my family's foundation donated to this city 20 years ago. The state-of-the-art computer lab your students use was funded by a grant from our foundation. The entire supplemental reading program for grades K through 5, also us. Over the past decade, my family has donated over $3 million to this school district. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. As of this morning, I have instructed my financial team to suspend all future grants and donations. Furthermore, I am personally funding a full, independent, and very public audit into this district's allocation of all charitable funds over the last 5 years. I want to see where every single dollar has gone. The room was so quiet I could hear the frantic beat of my own heart. The Langfords were frozen in horror. Principal Douglas looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Having completely dismantled them, Richard now laid out his terms. "Here is what is going to happen," he stated, his voice returning to its calm, commanding tone. First, the suspension will be immediately and permanently expunged from Ella's academic record. It will be as if it never happened. Second, you, Principal Douglas, will issue a formal written apology to both my daughter and my granddaughter for the distress and negligence they have endured. Third, you, he pinned the Langfords with a final, icy stare, will go home and explain to your daughter that any further contact with Ella, a single word, a look, a whisper in the hallway, will be considered targeted harassment, and the consequences will be immediate and severe. If I ever hear that my family has been troubled by you or yours again, I assure you, I will not be this. Restrained. He stood up, the meeting clearly over. We are going to the counselor's office now to collect my granddaughter. He looked at me, his eyes softening for the first time. Are you ready, Gianna? I stood up, my legs feeling steadier than they had in months. And for the first time in that school, I felt safe. I felt powerful. The walk out of the principal's office was a study in contrasts. Richard moved with a calm, unhurried gait, his hand resting gently on my back in a gesture of silent support. Behind us, a scene of utter collapse was unfolding. Principal Douglas, his face slick with sweat, was babbling apologies. Yes, Mr. Montgomery. Of course, Mr. Montgomery. It will all be handled immediately. I assure you, the Langfords were statues of shock, their faces pale and their eyes wide with the dawning realization of just how badly they had overplayed their hand. Richard didn't acknowledge any of it. He simply guided me down the hallway as if leaving a business meeting that had concluded successfully. We collected Ella from the counselor's office. She looked up as we entered, her small face a mixture of fear and confusion. When she saw Richard standing beside me, her eyes widened. He knelt down so he was on her level, his expression softening completely. Hello, Ella. Your mom and I had a good talk with your principal. Everything has been sorted out. There's no more trouble, he smiled. How would you like to get out of here and go get some ice cream? Ella's face broke into a tentative, then brilliant smile. She nodded, throwing her arms around his neck in a spontaneous hug that seemed to take even him by surprise. By the time we walked out of the school, news of the confrontation was already spreading with the impossible speed of schoolyard gossip. The suspension was officially erased from the system before we even reached the parking lot. That afternoon, an email went out to all third-grade parents from Principal Douglas, vaguely referencing a recent misunderstanding between students that had been amicably resolved. It went on to announce a new, school-wide initiative to reinforce a zero-tolerance policy on bullying in all its forms. No names were mentioned, but the message was crystal clear. The public humiliation for the Langfords came a few days later, at the weekly PTA meeting. Amelia Langford, the president and queen bee of the school's social scene, was conspicuously absent. At the beginning of the meeting, Principal Douglas stood up, his hands shaking so badly he had to grip the sides of the podium. He read from a prepared statement, his voice cracking, offering a humbling public apology for failing to follow district protocols in a recent student dispute and for not fostering an environment where all students feel safe and all parents feel heard. He pledged to do better. Every parent in that room knew exactly what he was talking about. It was a complete and total capitulation, a public stripping of the Langfords' perceived authority. The fallout rippled through their lives. The whispers started in the grocery store, at soccer practice, at the country club. The other wealthy parents, who had once orbited the Langfords, now gave them a wide berth. No one wanted to be associated with the family who had picked a fight with Richard Montgomery. Their power, built on a fragile foundation of intimidation and social climbing, crumbled overnight. The financial consequences were more direct. A week later, a small, meticulously worded article appeared in the local business journal, mentioning that Langford Development's much-hyped waterfront project was facing unexpected, opposition from key community stakeholders and environmental groups. It was a quiet act of professional assassination, likely orchestrated by Mr. Chen. Soon after, two of David's major investors, men who happened to sit on a charity board with Richard, pulled their funding, citing new concerns about the project's viability. David Langford's empire, which he had wielded like a club, was beginning to crack. Amidst their public destruction, my own family was quietly being rebuilt. A few nights after the school incident, Richard took Ella and me out for dinner. He didn't choose a fancy five-star restaurant designed to impress. He took us to a small, cozy Italian place with red checkered tablecloths and a waiter who knew his name. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed. For the first time in a long time, so was I. Richard didn't talk about the Langfords or the principal. He didn't say, "I told you so." He spent the entire dinner talking to Ella, asking her about her drawings, her favorite books, what she wanted to be when she grew up. He listened with a genuine interest that made her glow. She chattered away, her confidence and light returning with every word. As she was happily devouring a bowl of spaghetti, he looked at her and said softly, "You know, you have your mother's fire." "She's the strongest person I know." Ella beamed, her face smeared with tomato sauce. She looked at him with the pure, unfiltered honesty of an 8-year-old. "Are you my grandpa?" she asked. The question hung in the air. Richard didn't answer. He looked at me, his eyes asking a different question. "Will you let me be?" For 15 years, my answer had been a resounding no. I had kept him at arm's length, rejecting his help, his name, his love. I had believed that letting him in would make me weak, that it would invalidate my entire struggle, but I was wrong. I looked at this kind, patient man who had just moved heaven and earth for my child, and I saw not a threat to my independence, but its greatest champion. Tears welled in my eyes as I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a surrender, but it felt like a victory. Richard turned back to Ella, his face breaking into a warm, genuine smile. "Yes, Ella," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am, if you'll let me be." In that little Italian restaurant, surrounded by the smell of garlic and the sound of laughter, my old fortress of two opened its doors. I wasn't just accepting his help anymore. I was accepting him. I was finally, after all these years, letting family back in. Months have passed since that day in the principal's office. The autumn leaves have fallen, and a quiet layer of snow now covers the ground, muffling the world in a peaceful silence. The change in our lives is just as quiet, but just as profound. I see it every day when I pick Ella up from school. She doesn't walk out with her head down anymore, scanning the yard for threats. She runs out, laughing, surrounded by a group of friends, her bright pink backpack bouncing behind her. Her light, which I had feared was extinguished, now shines brighter than ever. She is happy. She is safe. The Langfords are still at the school, but they are ghosts of their former selves. Their power has vanished. Sophie is a quiet, solitary child now, the followers who once orbited her having moved on to a new queen bee. I sometimes see Amelia in the grocery store. She avoids my aisle, her gaze fixed on a box of cereal as if it contains the secrets of the universe. She doesn't sneer anymore. She just looks tired. I don't feel triumph when I see her, only a sad, distant pity. They built their world on fear, and it was a house of cards. My own world has been rebuilt on a new foundation. I still live in my small house. I still drive my old car. I still work at the nonprofit, a job I love. On the surface, nothing has changed. But on the inside, everything is different. The fierce, desperate need to prove myself, the chip on my shoulder that I had carried for so long, is gone. It has been replaced by a quiet sense of peace. My relationship with Richard has been transformed. There are no more grand gestures or offers of money. Instead, there is something far more valuable: family. He and my mother now come over for dinner every Sunday. He sits on our living room floor, his expensive suit jacket thrown over a chair, completely engrossed in building an impossibly complex Lego castle with Ella. He comes to her school plays and sits in the front row, his applause the loudest in the auditorium. He is not the billionaire Richard Montgomery. He is just Grandpa. One evening, a few weeks ago, I was at the penthouse. Ella was having a sleepover with my mom. I found Richard in his study, looking out at the glittering city skyline he had helped build. I stood beside him, and we watched the distant lights in comfortable silence. "Thank you, Richard," I said quietly, "for everything." He didn't look at me, but a small smile touched his lips. He simply said, "Welcome home, Gianna." And I finally understood what he meant. He wasn't talking about the penthouse. He was talking about the family I had finally allowed myself to come home to. I once believed that strength was about never needing help, about building your walls so high that no one could ever hurt you. I was wrong. That isn't strength. It's just loneliness. Real strength is found in the quiet courage it takes to admit you can't do it all alone. It's knowing who will stand beside you when you finally ask for help. So if anyone ever tries to make you feel small, if they ever tell you you're weak because you're on your own, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the most powerful forces in the world stand quietly, patiently, waiting behind the people who have been underestimated the most. All you have to do is be brave enough to make the call. If this story resonated with you, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel.